Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Ready for another deep dive? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Today, we're strapping in and diving deep into one of the biggest mysteries there is, consciousness.
The very essence of what makes you, you.
And we'll be exploring how this connects to this other huge question.
The self.
The self, yes. Who we are, how we experience the world, what it means to be a conscious being.
We're going to be drawing insights from a whole bunch of sources.
We've got philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, a real mix.
But our main guidebook for this deep dive is Anil Seth's book, Being You. A fantastic read, really digs into some fascinating and challenging ideas.
So Anil Seth kicks things off with a really powerful anecdote about being under general anesthesia.
Right, that experience of just nothingness.
Yeah, it's not just like falling asleep. It's like your entire inner world just vanishes. And he points out this really interesting thing. Under deep anesthesia, your brain's electrical activity almost completely flatlines.
It's true. That's way different even from the deepest sleep.
Right. So it really makes you wonder, without any consciousness, does the length of our lives even matter?
Deep question, isn't it? I mean, when we're sleeping, our brains are still active, creating dreams, processing information. But under anesthesia, that inner world just stops.
It's like hitting the pause button on your very existence.
It makes you rethink what it means to be.
For sure. And this isn't just theoretical. Understanding consciousness has huge implications.
Absolutely. Think about the medical field. Anesthesia, treating brain injuries, understanding mental illness, it's all connected.
And even just the changes in our sense of self as we age, that's tied in with consciousness too.
And Seth brings up this other interesting question right at the start. Is consciousness even possible without this sense of self, without that I feeling?
Would it even matter if we were aware, but didn't have that subjective experience of being a unique individual?
Food for thought, isn't it?
So let's talk about this idea of the embodied self. Seth calls us beast machines, which I love.
Haha, it is a catchy phrase, but it goes deeper than that.
Yeah, for a long time there was this view that animals were basically just machines. No consciousness, no self.
Descartes, right. He had this idea that humans were special because we have rational minds, a separate thinking substance. Animals were just matter, no mind.
But Seth flips this on its head. He says consciousness isn't about intelligence primarily. It's about being alive.
We are conscious because we are these incredible, complex biological systems.
Right, these beast machines that are constantly striving to stay alive.
And that feeling of being you, that sense of self, it comes from your brain constantly predicting and controlling your body's internal state.
So our sense of self is deeply rooted in our physical being.
It's not some separate ethereal thing. It's intertwined with the very processes that keep us alive.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. For years, the scientific study of consciousness was kind of ignored.
Yeah, seen as a bit too woo-woo, not a real science.
Seth quotes this psychologist from 1989 who said, "Nothing worth reading has been written on it."
Ouch. But you can kind of understand why people thought that. There were no good ways to measure consciousness, no clear experiments.
Then things started to change, thanks in part to Francis Crick, the guy who helped discover DNA.
He teamed up with Christoph Koch, and they decided to focus on something they called the neural correlates of consciousness.
NCCs. It sounds complicated, but basically they wanted to find the specific brain activity that goes along with having a conscious experience.
Right. Like if you see the color red, what exact pattern of brain activity is happening that makes you consciously see red?
They used all sorts of clever techniques to try and figure this out. One was this thing called binocular rivalry.
Imagine you're looking through a special set of goggles. One eye sees a cat, the other eye sees a dog.
Now, instead of seeing some weird cat-dog hybrid, your brain switches back and forth between seeing the cat and then the dog.
Your eyes are getting constant input, but your conscious experience is changing.
So by tracking brain activity during those switches, scientists can start to isolate those neural correlates of consciousness.
Pretty neat, huh?
Yeah, but then David Chalmers comes along and throws a wrench in the works. He distinguishes between the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness.
The easy problems are understanding how the brain does all sorts of amazing things, like recognizing objects, remembering things, using language.
Right. Those are still incredibly complex, but we can at least imagine how those processes might work in the brain.
But the hard problem is this. Why does any of this brain activity feel like something from the inside? Why do we have subjective experience?
It's like, why isn't the brain just a computer running in the dark? Why is there this feeling of what it's like to be conscious.
That's the hard problem. And Chalmers argues that even if we solve all those easy problems, the hard problem will still be there.
It's a huge challenge to our whole understanding of the world.
And some people, like the philosopher Colin McGinn, even think it's a problem we might never solve. That's the view called Mysterianism.
That we might just not be smart enough to ever figure it out.
A bit humbling, isn't it?
Yeah. But Anil Seth offers another way to think about it. He calls it the real problem of consciousness.
Which is more about trying to bridge the gap between the objective, physical brain and the subjective experience of consciousness.
So instead of getting stuck on the why, we can focus on understanding how the two are connected.
By carefully studying the relationship between the different qualities of our conscious experience and the underlying mechanisms of the brain.
Okay, so if we're going to study consciousness scientifically, we need ways to measure it. But it's not just about being conscious or not conscious, is it?
No, it's much more nuanced than that. Seth makes a distinction between conscious level and conscious content.
Conscious level is like, how aware are you? How awake are you?
It's a spectrum, right? From a coma where there's no consciousness at all to being fully awake and alert.
And then conscious content is what you're actually aware of, the sights, sounds, thoughts, feelings that make up your experience.
And those two things aren't always the same. You can be awake without being fully conscious.
Like when you're sleepwalking.
Or you can have vivid conscious experiences while you're asleep, like when you're dreaming.
So we need tools that can go beyond just measuring brain activity and actually assess the level of conscious awareness.
And there are some really cool new technologies being developed, like the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI.
PCI, okay. How does that work?
Well, they use this thing called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. It's a way to stimulate specific areas of the brain with magnetic pulses.
So they give the brain a little zap and then see how it responds.
Exactly. They measure the brain's electrical activity using EEG, and the key is to look at how complex that response is.
A more complex response means higher consciousness.
That's the idea. A highly complex response suggests the brain is capable of integrating information in a sophisticated way.
And they found that PCI values are much lower in unconscious states, like deep sleep or anesthesia.
But they're higher when someone is awake and aware. And even more interestingly, PCI seems to be able to distinguish between different levels of consciousness impairment in patients with brain injuries.
That's huge. It could help doctors figure out if someone in a vegetative state actually has some level of awareness.
That's right. It's potentially game-changing for diagnosis and treatment.
And Anil Seth's own research group has been developing similar techniques. But instead of zapping the brain, they analyze the complexity of the brain's spontaneous activity.
Zipping without zapping, as they call it.
And they're finding similar patterns. Lower complexity in deep sleep and anesthesia, higher complexity during REM sleep when we dream.
So these different approaches are starting to converge, suggesting that we're tapping into something fundamental about consciousness.
Okay, so we've talked about how to measure consciousness. But what actually is consciousness? Enter integrated information theory.
IIT, one of the most ambitious theories out there.
Developed by Giulio Tononi. This theory says that consciousness is literally just integrated information.
Not just correlated with it, but identical to it.
Whoa. Okay, so what does that even mean?
It means that subjective experience, that feeling of what it's like to be you, is fundamentally a property of certain types of information processing.
And that this kind of information is as real as mass or energy.
That even simple systems like atoms might have a tiny bit of consciousness, according to IIT.
Okay, now we're getting into some seriously mind-bending territory. So what makes a system conscious, according to IIT?
Two main things. First, it has to be highly informative. The current state of the system needs to rule out a vast number of other possible states.
So every experience you have is like narrowing down the possibilities of what you could be experiencing.
Precisely. Second, this information has to be highly integrated. The system as a whole has to generate more information than the sum of its parts.
So it's not just about having a bunch of separate pieces of information. It's about how those pieces are connected and working together.
And IIT uses this Greek letter phi to represent the amount of integrated information in a system. Higher phi, higher consciousness.
This theory could potentially explain why split-brain patients might have two separate streams of consciousness.
Right, because their two hemispheres are no longer communicating, they could be seen as two separate integrated systems.
And it also explains why the cerebellum, which has a ton of neurons, doesn't seem to be involved in consciousness.
because the way its neurons are connected isn't as conducive to high levels of integrated information, according to IIT.
But actually calculating phi for something as complex as the brain seems incredibly difficult.
Yeah, you'd need to know not just the current state of the system, but all of its possible past and future states. That's a lot of information.
So while IIT is a really interesting theory, it's still very hard to test its main claim.
That phi directly equals the level of conscious experience.
And some scientists, including Anil Seth, are exploring other approaches that focus more on the observer-relative aspects of information.
More grounded, measurable approaches.
Okay, so we've delved into what consciousness might be. Now let's talk about how we experience the world. And Seth introduces this idea of perception as controlled hallucination.
Basically, our brains are constantly making predictions about the world, and what we perceive is a combination of those predictions and the sensory information coming in.
So it's not just our senses passively receiving information, it's our brains actively constructing our experience.
We're not just seeing what's out there, we're seeing what our brain expects to see.
And this is happening all the time, unconsciously.
Like a top-down process, where our expectations and prior knowledge shape our perception.
It's like a Copernican revolution for our understanding of perception.
Instead of our minds passively reflecting the world, they're actively constructing it.
And the framework for how our brains do this is often described as Bayesian reasoning.
Which is all about combining prior beliefs with new evidence to update our beliefs.
Like Seth's example of the wet lawn. You wake up, see the wet lawn, and think it must have rained. But then you remember you set the sprinkler last night.
So your prior knowledge changes your interpretation of the sensory evidence.
And this is happening all the time, in every aspect of our perception.
Our brains are constantly making these Bayesian calculations to figure out what's most likely going on in the world.
And this top-down influence is so powerful that it can even lead to inattentional blindness.
Like that famous gorilla experiment where people are so focused on counting basketball passes that they completely miss the gorilla walking through the scene.
Our brains filter out information that we don't expect to see.
And Seth even tells a story about trying to fight a traffic ticket, where his focus on one aspect of the situation made him completely miss something obvious.
So our attention and expectations play a huge role in what we consciously perceive.
And then there's this even more active side of perception called active inference.
Where we don't just update our predictions based on sensory input, but we actually act on the world to make our predictions come true.
We're not just passively receiving information, we're actively shaping our experience through our actions.
So when you reach for your coffee cup, your brain is predicting what it will feel like to touch the cup, and it uses those predictions to guide your movement.
It's like our actions are a way of testing our predictions about the world.
And this active inference even suggests that some of our actions might be self-fulfilling prophecies.
Like when you move your eyes to scan a room, the feeling of your eye muscles moving is actually predicted by your brain before it happens.
So in a way, our brains are controlling our actions to make our predictions about the world come true.
It's a really fascinating perspective on how perception and action are intertwined.
And this idea of controlled hallucination connects to this concept in art called the beholder's share,
where the viewer of a piece of art brings their own interpretations and experiences to the work.
So it's not just about passively observing a painting, it's about actively constructing meaning from it.
Our brains are filling in the gaps, making inferences, and creating a whole experience based on limited sensory input.
And some researchers are even trying to experimentally induce hallucinations in the lab.
Using virtual reality and augmented reality to create these really trippy experiences.
They're finding that by manipulating the brain's predictive processes, they can actually make people perceive things that aren't really there.
Which further supports this idea that our normal perception is just a more controlled form of hallucination.
Okay, so this whole controlled hallucination thing, does it just apply to recognizing objects? Or does it go deeper than that?
Seth argues that it shapes our whole experience of the world, including how we experience objects over time, and even our sense of time itself.
So how does our brain create the illusion of stable objects?
Well, when we see a tomato, for example, we don't just see the side that's facing us. We perceive it as a complete object, with red skin all the way around.
Even though we can't see the back of it at that moment.
Right. And Seth says this is because our brain is making predictions about what we would see if we were to move the tomato or look at it from different angles.
So our perception of an object's stability over time is based on these predictions about how it would behave in different situations.
It's not just about the immediate sensory input, it's about our brain's model of the object's properties and how those properties would change over time.
And what about time itself? We don't have a sense organ for time, do we?
No, we don't. There's no time sensor in our brain.
So how do we experience the flow of time?
Seth suggests that our experience of time is also a kind of controlled hallucination constructed by our brain.
Based on the ongoing flow of perceptual information and our brain's predictions about how that information will change over time.
We perceive time passing because our brains are constantly predicting what's going to happen next, and those predictions are always being updated based on new sensory input.
So even though we might intellectually understand that our perception is a kind of controlled hallucination, things still feel real to us.
Right. Like Wittgenstein said, even though we know the Earth revolves around the sun, it still looks like the sun is rising and setting.
Our brains are so good at creating this illusion of reality that we can't help but experience it as real.
And this applies to our sense of self as well. That feeling of a stable, continuous me might also be a kind of controlled hallucination.
A perception constructed by our brain to make sense of the constant stream of information coming from our body and our interactions with the world.
And when this process breaks down, you can get some really strange experiences, like in hospital-induced delirium or Cotard delusion,
Where people might believe they're dead or that they don't exist.
which suggests that our sense of self isn't as fixed and unchanging as we might think.
It's more like an ongoing process, constantly being constructed and updated by our brains.
And Seth uses the teletransportation thought experiment to challenge our intuitions about the self.
You know, the idea of being instantly transported to another location by disassembling your body and then reassembling it,
Would that still be you on the other side?
it really makes you question what exactly makes you you.
And he points out that many philosophical and spiritual traditions have questioned the idea of a solid, unchanging self.
From ancient Buddhism to modern philosophers like Thomas Metzinger. So maybe the self isn't some fixed entity, but more like a dynamic process.
A collection of perceptions, memories, and predictions that are constantly being shaped by our experiences.
And even our sense of body ownership can be manipulated, as seen in the rubber hand illusion.
Where people can start to feel like a rubber hand is their own hand just by seeing it being touched at the same time as their real hand.
And what about out-of-body experiences? Those seem to suggest that our consciousness can actually separate from our physical body.
Seth explains those experiences as arising from disruptions in the brain's normal processes of multisensory integration and perspective taking.
So our brain is essentially constructing a different model of where our self is located in space.
And this can be influenced by things like stress, fatigue, or even certain types of brain injury.
There are even these virtual reality body swap illusions, where people can feel like they're inhabiting another person's body.
Which highlights just how flexible and malleable our sense of self can be.
But it sounds like the power of suggestion can play a big role in these embodiment illusions.
Yeah, our expectations and beliefs can definitely influence our experiences.
So we need to be careful about interpreting these kinds of subjective experiences.
And it's important to remember that there are different levels of selfhood.
We have this basic embodied self, the feeling of being a physical entity in the world.
And then there's our personal identity, our life story, our social self.
And those different aspects of self can be affected independently by things like brain injury or amnesia.
Like the famous case of Clive Waring, who lost his ability to form new memories, but still had a sense of his own identity.
Okay, so if consciousness and selfhood are these complex, embodied processes, it seems strange to think that only humans have them.
It would be pretty anthropocentric to assume that, wouldn't it?
What about animal consciousness? How can we know if other animals are conscious?
Well, we need to be careful about projecting our own human experiences onto other animals.
Right, assuming that they think and feel the same way we do.
But it seems likely that many animals have some form of conscious experience.
Especially mammals and birds. They have complex brains, they exhibit complex behaviors, they show signs of emotions.
And Seth argues that language and higher-level cognitive abilities might not be necessary for consciousness.
So an animal doesn't need to be able to talk or think about its own thinking to be conscious.
Right. The fundamental feeling of being alive might be a more basic form of consciousness that many animals share.
And even though some animals don't pass the mirror self-recognition test, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not self-aware.
The test might just not be a good measure of self-awareness in all species.
Like Seth's experience with the rhesus macaques. He felt they were definitely aware, even though they didn't recognize themselves in the mirror.
And then you have Creatures like octopuses, with their incredibly strange distributed nervous systems.
Their neurons are spread throughout their bodies, not just concentrated in a central brain.
So their experience of consciousness might be very different from ours.
Perhaps more fragmented or decentralized.
It's fascinating to think about all the different possible forms of consciousness that might exist out there in the animal kingdom.
Okay, so we've talked about human consciousness, animal consciousness. What about machine consciousness?
Could we ever create a conscious machine?
That's a big question. And it depends a lot on what your definition of consciousness is.
Right. If you believe in functionalism, the idea that consciousness is just a matter of information processing, then it might be possible.
Some researchers have even proposed specific criteria for machine consciousness.
Like global availability of information, which means that information can be accessed by any part of the system.
And self-monitoring, which means that the system can reflect on its own processes.
But Seth is skeptical about whether a machine could ever truly be conscious, even if it met those criteria.
He thinks there's something special about biological life that might be essential for consciousness.
He imagines this silicon beast machine, a robot that perfectly mimics the biological mechanisms of our brains.
But he still thinks it wouldn't be truly conscious because it wouldn't have that fundamental connection to life itself.
It wouldn't have evolved over billions of years to survive and reproduce.
So even if we can create machines that are incredibly intelligent and can mimic conscious behavior,
they might not ever have that subjective inner experience that we associate with consciousness.
and even if they don't, there's still a lot of ethical implications to consider.
Absolutely. As AI gets more powerful, we need to think carefully about the potential consequences.
Like the impact on jobs, the potential for bias in algorithms, the risks to privacy.
And the psychological effects of interacting with machines that seem conscious, even if we know they're not.
It's a whole new realm of ethical challenges that we need to start grappling with now.
We can't just wait until we've created a truly conscious machine to start thinking about these issues.
Okay, so before we wrap up, let's talk about this big overarching idea that Seth introduces, the free energy principle.
This is a really ambitious theory that tries to explain all sorts of things, from how organisms survive to how brains work, even evolution itself.
It's based on the idea that living systems are constantly trying to minimize their free energy.
Which is basically a measure of surprise.
So we're always trying to predict what's going to happen next and avoid being surprised.
In a way, yes. Our brains are constantly making models of the world and trying to minimize the difference between those models and our actual experiences.
And when there's a mismatch, we either update our models or we act on the world to make our predictions come true.
It's like our brains are trying to stay in a state of equilibrium where our predictions about the world are constantly being confirmed.
And this applies to everything, from how we perceive objects to how we make decisions.
The free energy principle suggests that all of our actions, perceptions, and even our thoughts are guided by this drive to minimize surprise.
So it's a very fundamental principle that could potentially explain a lot about how living systems work.
And some researchers are even trying to connect the free energy principle to other theories of consciousness, like IIT.
It's like a grand unifying theory of life and mind.
Pretty amazing, isn't it?
Definitely. And finally, what about free will? Where does that fit into this picture of the brain as a prediction machine?
Well, Seth argues against this traditional view of free will as some kind of magical ability to act independently of the laws of physics.
So no ghost in the machine controlling our actions.
Right. Instead, he sees our experience of free will as another kind of controlled hallucination.
So we feel like we're making choices, but really our brains are just following predictable patterns.
Not exactly. It's more nuanced than that. Our brains are constantly making predictions, but those predictions are also being influenced by our past experiences, our values, our goals.
So it's not like we're just robots following pre-programmed instructions.
Right. Our choices are still meaningful, even if they're not completely free from the constraints of our biology and our environment.
And Seth points out that the famous Lebed experiments, which seem to show that our brains make decisions before we're consciously aware of them.
Those experiments have been reinterpreted in ways that don't necessarily rule out free will.
So it's still an open question, but the free energy principle suggests that our experience of free will is a useful illusion.
It helps us to learn from our mistakes, to plan for the future, and to feel a sense of agency in our lives.
So to bring it all back to the real problem of consciousness, it seems like we're making progress in understanding how the subjective experience of consciousness is related to the objective workings of the brain.
By focusing on building those explanatory bridges between phenomenology and mechanism.
And the controlled hallucination framework seems to be a really powerful way of thinking about how our brains create our experience of the world, including our sense of self and even our experience of free will.
It's a constantly evolving field, but we're getting closer to understanding those deep mysteries of consciousness.
Well, that was an incredible journey through some truly mind-blowing ideas.
We've covered everything from the nature of consciousness and the self to the science of perception, the possibility of machine minds, and even the grand unifying theory of the free energy principle.
It's amazing to think that our everyday experience of being you is this incredibly complex, dynamic process.
And hopefully this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the incredible power and mystery of your own mind.
To wrap things up, we want to leave you with a thought to ponder.
How might this idea of perception as controlled hallucination change the way you view your own experiences and the world around you?
What does it mean to say that reality is a kind of controlled hallucination?
It's a question that could keep you thinking for a long time.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. Exploring those big, mind-bending questions that make us see the world in new ways.
Thank you for joining us on this adventure.
And until next time, keep diving deep.
And keep questioning everything.